I have personally cataloged 214 extreme biospheres across the civilized galaxy. My name, Rhal Veyn, carries weight within the highest echelons of the Orbital Coalition's exobiological division. I have quantified the neuro-venom of the silica-spiders of Vantari, mapped the collective consciousness of the methane oceans on Xylar Prime, and reduced the apex predators of a dozen designated deathworlds to neat, predictable algorithms. I have always maintained a singular, unshakable philosophy. Data is the universe's only universal language. Everything breathes, eats, reproduces, and dies according to a mathematical certainty. Then, the humans arrived and shattered my beautiful equations. At the time of their arrival, I was stationed on Nadir Halo. It is a state-of-the-art observation platform hanging in geostationary orbit, like a cowardly, metallic tick above Carthay 9. The Coalition does not go down to Carthay 9. Rational, evolved species do not go down to Carthay 9. The planet boasts electromagnetic typhoons that can strip a shuttle's navigation matrix in 40 seconds flat. It harbors corrosive microflora that digest synthetic polymers with terrifying efficiency, and a topography that actively, maliciously shifts beneath one's feet. Its biological food chain is a cascading nightmare of predatory evolution that our most advanced supercomputers have failed to model accurately for 3 standard cycles. It is a quarantine nightmare. Yet, the official records possessed by the Orbital Coalition showed that the species known as humanity had achieved interstellar transit in a fraction of the historical average time. That was a statistical anomaly. Certainly, but anomalies can usually be adjusted for with enough time and processing power. What caused genuine alarm in the High Council, what necessitated my presence on Nadir Halo in the first place, was their very first diplomatic request upon establishing contact. They did not ask for secure trade routes. They did not ask for resource extraction treaties or protected exclusion zones. They asked for direct, boots-on-the-ground access to Carthay 9. My assignment was straightforward, or so I foolishly believed. I was to evaluate their representative, a female human named Vale. Her official file listed her as a liaison envoy and hostile environment rescue specialist. A contradictory, utterly nonsensical title, in my professional opinion. One does not rescue things from a genuinely hostile environment. One merely calculates the acceptable loss margin, logs the fatalities, and moves on. To attempt a rescue in a Class 9 death zone is to invite further variables into an already failing equation. She docked at Bay 7 at exactly 0800 hours. I stood waiting with my standard, heavily armed security detachment, fully expecting the heavy power armor or energy-shielded environmental suits that any sane entity would wear near a quarantined atmospheric zone. Vale stepped out of the airlock wearing a simple, reinforced exploration jacket, utility fabric trousers, and scuffed boots. She carried no visible kinetic deterrence. She did not attempt to project physical dominance. My retinal scanner, a piece of technology that has never failed me, registered her resting heart rate at a steady 62 beats per minute. "Are you the welcoming committee?" she asked. Her voice was entirely devoid of the expected nervous fluctuation that typically accompanies a species' first encounter with Coalition authority. She took a deep, deliberate breath of the station's sterile, heavily recycled air and wrinkled her short, blunt nose. "I have to be honest, Researcher Veyn, your station smells like a frightened hospital." The remark was abrasive, a crude attempt at dark humor that I chose to ignore. Yet I found my initial annoyance overshadowed by a creeping sense of analytical dissonance. As she spoke, her eyes, those small, binocular, front-facing ocular organs, typical of a pursuit predator, flicked across the docking bay. In the span of perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, I watched her gaze lock onto the primary blast doors, trace the concealed ventilation shafts, note the strategic positioning of the 4 automated defense turrets, and evaluate the structural integrity of the viewing window leading to the void. She mapped every exit and every potential threat in the room, processing tactical geometry at an alarming rate. Yet her posture remained entirely relaxed. She strolled into the maximum security sector, as if walking through a serene botanical garden. I guided her to the observation lounge, hoping the reinforced glass floor offering a dizzying, terrifying view of Carthay 9's swirling violet storms below would instill some proper perspective. I attempted to impress upon her the magnitude of her species' miscalculation. I recited the mortality statistics. I explained the corrosive nature of the atmospheric spores and the viciousness of the local fauna. A Deathworld is not a tourist destination. Envoy Vale, I stated, tapping my datapad to project a holographic cross-section of a local silicon-based parasite to emphasize my point. It is the universe's way of saying that you do not belong there. It is a biological quarantine designed by evolution itself. To ignore it is to embrace extinction. Mara leaned against the cold metal bulkhead, her arms loosely crossed, watching the violent weather patterns churning thousands of miles below with genuine, unfeigned fascination. "We do not view a Deathworld as a warning, Rhal Veyn," she replied softly, her voice possessing a chilling, unwavering calmness. "We view it as a puzzle. It is simply an environment with a very strict set of rules. If you learn the rules, if you respect the rules, you learn how to live alongside it." The implication of her words sent a cold spike of static electricity through my secondary nervous system. Coexist with the apex predators of a planet that actively tries to digest its own crust. Rational species build walls. They build orbital platforms to remain safe above the chaos, to study it from afar, hidden behind impenetrable layers of energy shielding and automated guns. Yet, here she stood, a creature that looked frail enough to break under the sheer pressure of Carthay 9's gravity, casually discussing learning the rules of a planetary slaughterhouse as if it were a parlor game. I began mentally formulating my preliminary report for the Council. I concluded that Mara Vale was either suffering from an acute delusion of immortality, a common, often fatal defect in nascent spacefaring civilizations who overestimate their technological prowess, or that humanity as a whole shared an evolutionary deviation, an unprecedented malfunction of the basic biological survival instinct. There was no other logical explanation for her behavior. Then, my secure comlink chimed twice, an urgent override code interrupting my silent diagnosis. I excused myself formally, turning away from her steady, unnerving gaze to check the terminal. The encrypted message was an automated alert from the station's deep-level biological surveillance matrix. I stared at the incoming data stream, the cold blue glow of the numbers reflecting off my compound eyes, feeling a sudden, inexplicable drop in my core temperature. Nadir Halo housed exactly 28 captive apex predator specimens retrieved from Carthay 9. They were kept in maximum security observation bays, separated by 200 meters of hard vacuum, magnetic containment fields, and reinforced titanium bulkheads from the docking ring. For 3 standard cycles, they had remained either aggressively territorial or predictably dormant in their pacing. At 0800 hours, precisely the moment when Mara Vale's boot first touched the deck of the station, all 28 specimens simultaneously threw themselves against their containment fields in a state of absolute, hyperkinetic agitation. I scanned the biometric readouts, searching for an error. The data did not indicate a feeding frenzy. It did not indicate territorial aggression or mating displays. According to the flood of stress hormones saturating their isolated enclosures, the most dangerous biological weapons in the known quadrant were displaying synchronized, unadulterated panic. The predators on the station were terrified, and as I slowly turned my head to look back at the small, smiling human standing by the window, I realized I was locked in a room with the reason why. I guided her out of the observation lounge and into the primary biological analysis wing. The corridor was bathed in the sterile, actinic glare of full-spectrum sterilization lamps. I wanted her to see the reality of Carthay 9 up close, safely secured behind molecularly bonded transparent aluminum. We approached the first series of stasis cylinders. Inside the first enclosure, suspended in a zero-gravity antiseptic gel, floated a creature resembling a jagged shard of obsidian. A radiation-reactive crustacean analog, I explained, watching its armored plates ripple from deep crimson to a sickly, iridescent violet as the cylinder's internal emitters pulsed with synthetic ultraviolet light. It metabolizes raw gamma radiation. The color shifts are a biological warning system, signaling its toxicity levels to potential threats. We moved to the next containment zone. A thick, fibrous mass of pale vines clung to a simulated rock face. As Mara stepped closer, the vines shuddered. Microscopic filaments extended outward, trembling like tuning forks. The whisperweed, I noted, monitoring the environmental telemetry on my datapad. It possesses no auditory organs. Instead, it senses the rhythmic vibrations of a cardiovascular system. It listens for a heartbeat. Once it locks onto a rhythm, it releases neurotoxic spores designed to paralyze the host, allowing the vines to burrow and feed at their leisure. In the third containment field, a cloud of what appeared to be glittering golden dust swirled in a mesmerizing, chaotic dance. And these, I pointed with a perfectly steady claw, are predatory spores. They do not react to movement or heat. They react to neural patterns. Specifically, the electrical impulses generated by the intent to kill. If you harbor aggressive thoughts, they swarm, enter the respiratory tract, and initiate rapid cellular necrosis. I observed Mara intently, waiting for the inevitable biological response. Representatives from the avian conclaves of the upper spiral arm usually hyperventilated at this point. The robust, subterranean dwelling species of the outer rim would instinctively take a step backward, their heavy brows furrowed in revulsion. Mara Vale did none of these things. She stood mere inches from the glass, her posture relaxed, her breathing perfectly even. She watched the deadly golden dust swirl with the calm appreciation of someone observing a mild snowfall. She did not look disgusted. She did not recoil. Instead, she turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto mine with an unsettling intensity, and asked a question that completely derailed my prepared lecture. "Tell me, Researcher Veyn," she murmured, her voice steady and inquisitive, "which of these species hunts out of pure curiosity rather than just hunger?" The question was profoundly irritating. It applied a totally alien psychological framework to a perfectly logical ecosystem. I adjusted my posture, feeling a prickle of defensive academic pride. "You misunderstand the fundamental nature of this planet. Envoy Vale," I corrected her firmly. "On Carthay 9, predation is not merely a biological necessity for caloric intake. It is a complex, hyper-accelerated exchange of information. It is the language of dominance. Higher-tier organisms here do not waste energy on idle curiosity. They kill to establish their position within the ecological hierarchy. To hunt for curiosity is an evolutionary inefficiency." Mara chuckled. It was a soft, dry sound that echoed strangely in the sterile corridor. "Evolution is rarely perfectly efficient," she countered, turning her gaze back to the whisperweed. "Where I come from, survival is a lot messier. On Earth, we have massive marine mammals, whales. That coordinate complex, multi-layered strategies to trap schools of fish, communicating across vast oceans. We have aquatic invertebrates, octopuses, capable of solving mechanical puzzles and escaping sealed enclosures simply because they are bored. We have avian species, crows, that not only recognize the facial features of specific individuals who have wronged them, but also pass that grudge down to their offspring." She took a slow step toward the next sector, her hands still casually tucked into the pockets of her jacket. "As for us, my species took the apex predators of our continents, the wolves, and turned them into companions. We did not eradicate them. We domesticated them. And when our tectonic plates shift and shatter the ground beneath us, we do not abandon the territory. We simply build our cities right on top of the geological fault lines, daring the planet to try again. I listened to her words, waiting for the biometric scanners in the ceiling to flag her statements as gross exaggerations. A species building civilizations on active seismic fractures, domesticating their natural predators. It was biological heresy. Yet, the ambient sensors relayed a terrifying truth directly to my ocular interface. Her heart rate remained flat. Her galvanic skin response was entirely normal. She was not bragging. She was stating mundane, everyday facts about her homeworld. We transitioned from the microfauna analysis wing into the macro-predator live containment block. The air here was thicker, heavy with the recycled scent of ozone, synthetic proteins, and the pheromones of captive killers. This was the sector housing the larger, more kinetic specimens. As we approached Containment Cell Unit 7, the ambient lighting automatically dimmed. Inside, a Varese hound paced relentlessly. It was a nightmare of biological engineering, an amalgam of dense muscle, razor-sharp chitinous plating, and a sensory array capable of tracking prey through solid rock. It stood easily, as tall as my chest, moving with a silent, terrifying grace. The moment Mara walked into its line of sight, the creature froze. Its multi-jointed legs coiled like compressed springs. It caught her scent through the localized atmospheric exchange vents. With a sudden, explosive burst of kinetic energy, the Varese hound launched itself forward. It slammed its massive, armored skull directly against the invisible, high-voltage energy shield separating us. The impact resonated through the deck plating, a thunderous crash that caused my own mandibles to click in involuntary alarm. I reached for the atmospheric controls, ready to flood the chamber with heavy sedatives, assuming the electromagnetic shielding was causing some form of localized neurological interference. But before my digits could touch the console, the creature's behavior drastically altered. It did not strike the shield a second time. It did not bare its serrated mandibles in a threat display. Instead, the Varese hound stopped dead, its heavy head lowered. It took one slow, deliberate step backward, then another. Its visual receptors remained locked entirely on Mara, ignoring me completely. The beast retreated, shrinking its mass, until it had backed itself into the deepest, darkest corner of its cell. I checked the neural telemetry streaming from the creature's cortical implant. The data was impossible. It was not experiencing pain from the energy shield. It was not experiencing blind, aggressive rage. The readouts clearly indicated acute cognitive avoidance. The apex predator of the northern ash plains was acting exactly as if it had just recognized something it absolutely should not test. Mara did not flinch during the creature's initial charge. She did not raise her hands. She did not step back. She merely stood there, her head slightly tilted, observing the beast cowering in the shadows. She smiled. It was a small, fleeting expression, utterly devoid of provocation or malice. "You see, Researcher Veyn," she said quietly, her eyes still on the darkness of the cell. "Many true apex predators are highly intelligent. They have to be. They are exceptionally good at categorizing the world around them. They can instantly distinguish between a prey item, a territorial rival, and something that will make them deeply regret their life choices." I felt a profound chill settle into the marrow of my bones. I brought up a blank file on my datapad and began to type furiously. I hypothesized that humans, despite their lack of natural armor, venom, or significant physical strength, must emit an array of microsignals. Perhaps it was a specific pheromone signature, a subvocal frequency, or a subconscious postural alignment characteristic of long-distance pursuit predators. Whatever it was, the Orbital Coalition had never encountered it, and we possessed absolutely no baseline metrics to read it. She was transmitting a biological broadcast of supreme, unquestionable lethality, and every beast on the station could hear it loud and clear. Before I could formulate a coherent question to challenge her terrifying assertion, the emergency illumination strips running along the ceiling flashed a violent, aggressive crimson. A piercing, multi-tonal klaxon shattered the tense silence of the containment block. My wrist-mounted communication terminal vibrated violently. It was a Level 1 classified priority override, transmitted directly from the planetary surface command channel. Only the highest echelon of the Coalition Directorate possessed the clearance to initiate such an alert. I opened the transmission. The text scrolled across my vision in frantic, fragmented bursts. The surface of Carthay 9 had just gone completely dark. We had lost all telemetry, all visual feeds, and all vital signs from excavation outpost number 4. It was a black site installation, buried deep beneath the shifting tectonic plates, dedicated entirely to the study of an unannounced, ancient biological anomaly. And as of 60 seconds ago, it had ceased to exist on our monitoring grid. The crimson strobe of the emergency illumination bathed the corridor in a rhythm of simulated panic. The multi-tonal klaxon continued its relentless assault on my auditory receptors. I swiped a trembling claw across my wrist-mounted terminal, desperately trying to re-establish a handshake protocol with the surface. The connection remained stubbornly dead. A solid wall of encrypted static was all that returned from the planetary crust. An entire facility does not simply vanish from a closed-loop monitoring grid, I muttered, my mandibles clicking in a rapid staccato of anxiety. It does if someone pulled the plug from the inside, Vale said. I snapped my head up. She had not moved toward the emergency egress hatches. She had not adopted a defensive crouch. She was watching me, and the previous mild curiosity in her dark eyes had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating edge. Let us stop pretending. Researcher Veyn, she stated, her voice slicing through the wailing alarm with surgical precision. I read the orbital trajectories of this station before I boarded. I mapped the energy signatures. You have 3 standard ecological observation modules, but you have a massive, heavily shielded terra-boring platform anchored directly above the northern ash plains. You are drawing enough power to sustain a mid-sized colony, funneling it directly down to the surface. She took a slow step toward me, forcing me to tilt my head back slightly. Why does a peaceful ecological monitoring station require a militarized excavation grid? And why is every single data packet concerning Carthay 9 locked behind Level 9 strategic encryption? I instinctively took a step back, my internal thermal regulators struggling to compensate for a sudden spike in core heat. Envoy Vale, you are stepping outside the bounds of your diplomatic clearance. The operations at Outpost Number 4 are highly classified Coalition matters. Classified, she repeated, the word dripping with an icy skepticism. You just lost an entire black site on a quarantined Deathworld, and your captive specimens up here are having synchronized panic attacks. Your classifications are currently getting people killed. Tell me what you dug up. I opened my mouth to recite the standard non-disclosure statutes, to threaten her with immediate deportation back to Earth space. But looking into her face, I saw a terrifying absolute. She was not going to leave. She was not going to panic. She was going to stand there until the station ripped itself apart or until I gave her the truth. The political armor of the Orbital Coalition felt remarkably thin under the gaze of a pursuit predator. It is not a natural planetary body, I confessed, the words tasting like ash in my throat. The admission violated 17 separate confidentiality oaths. Yet the immediate threat of her unwavering stare outweighed the distant threat of a tribunal. The storms, the shifting topography, the hyper-aggressive flora, none of it is the result of random evolutionary mutation. The Coalition has suspected for 2 standard decades that Carthay 9 is a constructed biosphere, an engineered ecological zone left behind by a precursor civilization. Mara did not look surprised. She merely absorbed the information, her mind seamlessly integrating the new variable. A weaponized terrarium. And what were they keeping inside it? Not what, I corrected, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper despite the blaring alarms. Who? Outpost number 4 was established to excavate a deep-crust biological anomaly. We found fossilized, and then dormant, records of an ancient predatory species. It does not just hunt. It acts as a biological neural node for the entire biosphere. It emits a frequency, a chemical or telepathic resonance, that dictates the behavior of the entire food chain around it. Mara's eyes narrowed infinitesimally. I could almost see the tactical architecture of the planet rearranging itself in her mind. If it is a true keystone apex, she deduced rapidly, then every single beast on this planet does not just hunt because it is hungry. They react according to the broadcast pattern of that central node. The entire planet is a synchronized pack. Yes, I breathed, feeling a profound sense of doom settling over me. And the Council realized that our own supercomputers could not decode the hunting logic of a deathworld. We lacked the instinctual framework. I paused, the shame of my superior's machinations finally catching up with me. That is why your species was granted access so quickly. The Coalition did not invite humanity for diplomacy. They wanted to introduce a variable from a known, thriving deathworld. They wanted to see if an Earth native could read the operational logic of Carthay 9's ecosystem. They wanted to know if you could understand the monster they were trying to unearth. The silence that stretched between us was heavier than the gravity plating beneath our boots. I braced myself for the inevitable human explosion of righteous anger. The demands for immediate extraction, the threats of interstellar war. Mara merely tilted her head. Her expression was devoid of fury. It was utterly, terrifyingly clinical. "Were you planning to use us as a yardstick?" she asked, her tone dropping to absolute zero. "Or as bait?" The question struck me with the physical force of a kinetic round. A yardstick to measure the predator, or bait to draw it out. I wanted to defend the honor of the High Council, to insist that we were scientists, not butchers. But the words died before they reached my mandibles. I looked at the flashing red lights. I thought of the secretive nature of the excavation, the heavy armament of the station, and the sudden, inexplicable arrival of this lone, unarmored human. I realized, with a sickening drop in my primary stomach, that the Council had likely calculated the probabilistic outcomes for both scenarios, and found either acceptable. Before I could formulate a lie or a desperate apology, the main terminal on the bulkhead violently sparked to life. The encryption lockout shattered. A raw, unshielded emergency signal from the planetary surface forced its way through the jamming field. The holographic projector spat out a heavily distorted, static-laced visual feed. It was the interior of Outpost Number 4. But it was not a scene of a perimeter breach. The massive, reinforced external blast doors were completely intact, sealed tight against the outside world. The devastation was entirely internal. The feed showed the primary laboratory level. The heavy titanium support columns were bent outward, sheared by an unimaginable kinetic force. Research personnel in heavy environmental suits were scattered like discarded toys, their armor ruptured. The destruction radiated from the center of the room, exactly where the secure containment vault was located. Whatever had destroyed the outpost had not broken in. It had been brought inside, and then it had broken out. The camera feed jerked wildly as the mount collapsed, coming to rest at a skewed angle on the blood-slicked deck. Into the frame crawled a high-ranking Coalition xenobiologist. His breathing apparatus was shattered. He dragged himself toward the recording lens, his compound eyes wide with a terror that transcended the boundaries of species. He reached out a trembling claw, smearing viscous blue fluids across the lens. He did not call for rescue. He did not issue a tactical report. He stared directly into the visual pickup and rasped exactly one sentence before his vital signs flatlined. "It does not hunt the weak. It hunts what dares to look back." The audio feed cut out with a sharp, electronic squeal. The hologram collapsed back into a single point of light and vanished. The ensuing silence lasted for exactly 2 seconds. Then, the station's artificial intelligence core bypassed all localized command structures. The gentle, synthesized voice of the nadir Halo operations system echoed through the corridor, entirely incongruous with the flashing crimson lights. Code Black protocol initiated. Complete biological quarantine in effect. Commencing sector isolation. Heavy, meter-thick containment bulkheads began to slam down from the ceiling at regular intervals down the length of the corridor. The grinding scream of metal on metal was deafening. I grabbed Mara's sleeve, intending to pull her toward the central command elevator, the only secure route to the fortified command center. She ripped her arm away with surprising strength. She was not looking at the elevator. She was looking at the specific sequence of the descending bulkheads. Her eyes darted from the ceiling to the floor, analyzing the lockdown pattern. "They are not sealing the station to keep something out," she said, stepping back as a massive steel wall slammed into the deck just 10 meters to our left, cutting off the route to the escape pods. "They are routing us." I looked at the bulkheads. She was right. The isolation protocol was not random. It was a deliberate, algorithmic funnel. And as the final blast door directly in front of the command sector began to rapidly descend, separating the civilian research wing from the heavily armored council chambers, I realized the terrifying truth. The station council was abandoning the outer ring, and they were deliberately making sure the human envoy was trapped on the wrong side of the wall. A massive kinetic shockwave slammed into the orbital platform, violently interrupting the descent of the final containment bulkhead. The impact was not an external strike from a rogue micrometeorite. It felt as though the very fabric of gravity beneath us had momentarily inverted. The deck plating heaved upward, throwing me against the cold steel of the corridor wall. The atmospheric processors whined in agonizing protest, their mechanical hum twisting into a high-pitched scream. All around us, the strobing crimson emergency lights fractured into a blinding, chaotic smear as the station groaned under an impossible torsion. The automated voice of the nadir Halo mainframe did not announce a structural breach. Instead, it announced a catastrophic system override. The gentle, synthesized tone echoed through the ringing in my auditory receptors, delivering a message of pure, unadulterated nightmare. It confirmed that the biological locking mechanisms securing the primary, secondary, and tertiary live containment sectors had just been completely disengaged. The molecular containment fields were nullified. It was not a mechanical glitch caused by the shockwave. The telemetry scrolling rapidly across my wrist-mounted terminal indicated a clean, authorized digital handshake. Someone, or something down on the planetary crust, had transmitted a localized command code that our highly advanced security architecture accepted as absolute, overriding authority. I scrambled to pull up the internal surveillance grid on my terminal, fully expecting to witness a localized bloodbath. I anticipated seeing the captive beasts tearing each other apart in a blind, territorial frenzy of newfound freedom. What the grainy security feeds actually revealed froze the circulatory fluid in my primary veins. The silica-spiders, the chitinous crawlers, and the heavy-plated reptilian hunters were not fighting. They poured out of their shattered glass enclosures in perfect, terrifying unison. They moved like a singular, fluid shadow, flowing down the primary arteries of the station with synchronized, militaristic precision. They were not panicking. They had received a planetary broadcast, an overriding imperative from the ancient neurological node we had so foolishly disturbed. Before I could fully process the horrifying implications of this organized biological swarm, my direct line to the command deck chimed. A synthesized voice cut through the blaring, multi-tonal claxons, issuing a new, devastating directive. The Station Council had authorized a selective evacuation protocol. The announcement mandated that all senior research directors, Military attachés and personnel carrying secure data drives were to proceed immediately to the central escape vector. Outer ring technical crews, civilian maintenance personnel, and low-level medical staff were explicitly directed to shelter in place and await further instruction. Vale did not flinch at the sound of the alarm, nor did she look toward the heavy blast door that separated us from the safe zone. "They are leaving them behind," she stated, her voice slicing through the mechanical wail of the sirens. She did not sound panicked. She sounded utterly disgusted. "Shelter in place is a death sentence on a compromised grid. By concentrating the unarmed civilians in the outer ring, your council is actively creating a localized pheromone beacon. The panic sweat, the elevated heart rates, the raw scent of terror. Those people are not sheltering. They are being used as chum to draw the hunting pack away from the command shuttles. For the first time in my decorated, meticulously compliant career, a spark of absolute, irrational fury ignited within my primary thorax. I activated my communication relay, desperately attempting to patch a localized override to open the auxiliary bulkhead doors for the trapped maintenance sectors. I shouted into the transmitter, demanding that command open the lower decks, warning them that the concentrated biosignatures would attract every apex predator on the platform. The response was immediate, cold, and entirely automated. My access was denied. My security clearance was permanently revoked. The system ordered me to proceed to the central vector immediately. My terminal screen went dead, flashing a stark red lock symbol. My superiors had locked me out of my own life's work, prioritizing their encrypted hard drives over thousands of beating hearts. A nearby wall monitor flickered to life, tapping into a localized, unencrypted security feed from a civilian auxiliary corridor in Sector 4. A Vares hound had already bypassed the hastily constructed heavy barricades. The camera angle showed a dozen unarmed maintenance technicians pressed frantically against a sealed blast door, their faces twisted in absolute, paralyzing terror. The hound did not leap blindly into the fray. It stalked forward, its multi-jointed limbs moving with horrifying, deliberate grace. It was not using its optical receptors to track them. Its cranial sensory pits flared wide, locking entirely onto the frantic, unified drumming of 12 terrified cardiovascular systems. The feed cut to static, just as the beast tensed its powerful hind legs. The central elevator shaft behind the reinforced wall chimed loudly, signaling the final departure car for the command staff. It was a straight sprint down a secured, heavily automated hallway. Safety, survival, and a coward's retreat lay exactly 50 meters away. I looked at the impenetrable steel, and then I looked at Vale. She had already turned her back on the escape route. Without a single word of hesitation, she unsealed a heavy industrial plasma cutter from a nearby emergency bulkhead locker. She checked the magnetic charge with practiced, terrifying efficiency, and pivoted directly toward the compromised civilian sector. She did not ask me to follow. She simply began walking into the slaughterhouse, stepping into the dim, red-lit corridor where the screams were beginning to echo. I looked at the sleek, pristine elevator doors, representing everything logical and rational in my universe. Then, I looked at the small, fragile human walking willingly toward a horde of alien nightmares. My mandibles clicked rapidly in a physical manifestation of acute cognitive dissonance. I abandoned my counsel. I abandoned my career. I abandoned every biological survival instinct my species possessed. I broke into a desperate run, catching up to her, just as she sliced through the locking mechanism of the first jammed access door. We moved silently through the maintenance arteries. The air here was thick, heavy with the copper stench of fresh blood and the bitter, acrid tang of severed electrical conduits. The emergency lights snapped and popped above us, casting long, distorted shadows across the gore-slicked deck plating. We found torn fabric, shattered data pads, and the grim, undeniable evidence of the pack's swift progression. But what truly terrified me What made my respiratory gills flare in silent panic was the profound structural damage inflicted upon the station itself. We passed a heavy industrial blast door, leading to the lower environmental controls. It had not been cut open with a plasma torch, nor had its locking mechanism been expertly bypassed. It had been physically bent inward. The heavy titanium alloy, specifically designed and cast to withstand a direct micrometeorite impact at high velocity, was warped and buckled like a piece of discarded foil. Deep, jagged grooved scratch marks gouged the indestructible metal, creating a ragged opening large enough for a small transport shuttle to pass through effortlessly. Whatever had squeezed its way through this reinforced corridor was exponentially larger and vastly more powerful than anything the Coalition had officially catalogued in the maximum security bays. We finally reached the threshold of the primary medical wing. The automated triage sirens were still wailing their mournful tune, but the vast, open room was entirely empty of survivors. Strangely, it was also completely empty of the smaller predators. The silicate-spiders and the lesser Vares hounds had clearly been here. The gruesome evidence was painted in vivid strokes across the sterile white walls and overturned examination tables. Yet, they had not stayed to consume their prey. They had cleared out completely, abandoning a target-rich environment. "They are yielding," Mara whispered, her dark eyes tracking a series of distinctive, massive, undisturbed drag marks leading straight away from the medical bay and progressing toward the heavily shielded primary reactor core. "This is basic pack dynamics. The smaller hunters eat first, unless the dominant presence claims the entire kill zone for itself." They did not just leave. They actively cleared the path. I rushed toward a ruined medical diagnostic console, frantically bypassing the shattered optical interface to reroute the localized auxiliary power directly to the internal thermal imaging grid. The visual cameras in the reactor sector were completely dead, reduced to useless static, but the ambient heat sensors embedded in the floor plating were still pinging their data back to the mainframe. I pulled up the localized topological map of the lower decks. A massive, terrifying bloom of blinding white and crimson heat completely dominated the center of the screen. It was not a localized chemical fire or a ruptured plasma conduit. It was a dense, living biological furnace. The heat signature was utterly gargantuan, dwarfing the anatomical proportions of a mature Vares hound by a factor of 10 or more. It was a shape that existed in no Coalition database, a sprawling nightmare of hyperdense muscle mass, heavy bone plating, and ambient core radiation. The ancient neurological node down on the planetary surface had not merely sent a broadcast signal to orchestrate a riot. It had sent its supreme enforcer to ensure the task was completed. Predator Alpha had just boarded the main deck. We burst through the heavy maintenance hatch and spilled out into the primary logistics and transport corridor. This massive thoroughfare was originally designed to move heavy industrial terraforming machinery, built wide enough for two massive cargo haulers to pass side by side without scraping their reinforced hulls. Now, it was a cavern of deep shadows, illuminated only by a few flickering, amber utility lights that struggled to pierce the sudden, oppressive gloom. The ambient air temperature dropped drastically the moment the hatch sealed behind us. The sharp, metallic stench of electrified ozone and burnt wiring vanished completely, instantly replaced by a deep, earthy odor that smelled of ancient, pulverized bone and stagnant, subterranean waters. Then, the creature stepped out from the darkness of the loading bay intersection, and the universe seemed to hold its breath. It did not roar. It did not strike the deck plating to announce its presence. It simply existed, occupying the physical space with the terrifying gravitational pull of a collapsed star. The beast stood well over 3 meters in height, forcing it to lower its massive shoulders slightly beneath the overhead transit rails. Its skin was not merely a dark pigment. It possessed a bizarre, light-absorbing quality, a matte biological void that seemed to drink the ambient amber illumination of the corridor, rendering its exact muscular contours difficult for my compound eyes to track. A jagged, asymmetrical crown of pale, calcified bone erupted from its heavy, sloping skull, heavily shielding its primary sensory organs from any conceivable kinetic strike. Its front limbs were terrifying marvels of evolutionary engineering. They were heavily corded with dense muscle fibers and ended in elongated, multi-jointed appendages that looked designed equally for feeling microscopic seismic tremors in the planetary crust and for tearing effortlessly through reinforced starship armor. My respiratory gills clamped shut in a violent, involuntary spasm. I knew this terrifying silhouette from the highly classified, heavily redacted holographic fossil records recovered from excavation outpost number 4. The Coalition scientists had given it a temporary, sterile placeholder designation in their secret files. Null Fang. It was the biological broadcast tower. It was the living keystone, capable of weaponizing an entire planetary ecosystem with a single, undetectable chemical or telepathic command. The cacophony of the failing orbital station died in an instant. The frantic, metallic scratching of the silica-spiders in the overhead ventilation shafts ceased entirely. The distant, rhythmic thudding of the Varus hounds, pacing the lower civilian decks, vanished as if they had been erased from existence. Every lesser biological nightmare currently loose aboard the orbital platform went perfectly, completely silent. They were yielding the hunting ground to their absolute king. The resulting stillness was profoundly heavy, vastly more oppressive and terrifying than the blaring emergency klaxons had been just moments before. The absence of sound became a physical weight pressing down against my carapace. I was trapped in a state of absolute chemical paralysis. My secondary nervous system was suddenly flooded with an overwhelming, debilitating cocktail of submission enzymes. My rational mind screamed at my legs to run, to scramble behind the discarded transport crates, to do absolutely anything to escape its line of sight. But my muscles utterly refused the command. I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that a single twitch, one single ragged intake of breath, would shatter the fragile tension and turn the wide transport corridor into a localized slaughterhouse. Beside me, Mara Vale moved. She did not raise the heavy industrial plasma cutter she had used to breach the maintenance doors. Instead, she deliberately let the heavy tool slip from her grasp. It clattered against the metal deck plating with a deafening, echoing crash, rolling away into the shadows. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing my entire body for the inevitable, blinding pain of sudden dismemberment. I waited for the beast to cross the distance in a blur of black muscle and snapping bone. The pain never came. I forced my ocular receptors open to see Mara stepping forward exactly 1/2 of a pace. She deliberately lowered her center of gravity, planting her scuffed boots firmly on the cold metal. She raised both of her hands, palms facing outward, entirely empty of any weapon or defensive tool. She presented her highly vulnerable throat and her unarmored chest directly to the apex predator of an engineered deathworld. Then, the fragile human did the most profoundly terrifying thing I had ever witnessed in my long, meticulously documented life. She smiled. It was not a grimace of fear masquerading as foolish bravado. It was not the bared teeth threat display of a cornered, desperate animal hoping to intimidate a vastly superior foe, just long enough to escape. I watched the minute micro-expressions playing across her face, the relaxed, unclenching set of her jaw, the steady, focused intensity of her dark eyes. She was intentionally reconstructing a highly specific, complex, nonverbal signal. It was the calm, chillingly polite acknowledgement of one pursuit predator, recognizing another in the wild. Her posture broadcasted an unmistakable message across the species barrier. I am not panicking. I am not begging for my life. I am entirely aware of what you are, and I am choosing to hold my ground. Nullfang immediately halted its slow, lethal advance. The massive creature tilted its heavily armored head, the bone crown scraping lightly against a low-hanging ventilation duct. It took one Extremely slow step forward, closing the distance until the sheer ambient heat, radiating from its massive internal furnace, washed over us in suffocating, invisible waves. It lowered its immense, heavy skull, bringing its dark, fathomless sensory pits perfectly level with Mara's face. The beast inhaled deeply, pulling the air from around her into its complex, highly evolved olfactory system. For a terrifying span of perhaps 10 seconds, neither of them moved a single muscle. Then, a subtle but profound physiological shift occurred. The thick, rigid neural spines running down the entire length of Nulfang's spine, which had been sharply flared in aggressive, predatory anticipation just moments before, slowly flattened against its light-absorbing skin. The ancient beast was processing a massive biological paradox. It had just encountered an organism that possessed no natural armor plating, no visible biological weapons, and no overwhelming physical mass. Yet this small bipedal organism was not radiating the intoxicating, metallic pheromones of prey. Mara was not behaving according to the established rules of any ecological hierarchy the beast had ever dominated. Mara kept her smile perfectly intact. She absolutely refused to break eye contact with the void black creature. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was little more than a controlled whisper. Yet it carried with crystal clarity through the dead, silent air of the transport corridor. "If you want to hunt, you must be absolutely certain you will still be alive after the first strike." The words were spoken in human English, entirely meaningless acoustic syllables to the ancient terror standing before us. But the psychological intent driving them was universal. It was a cold, calculated promise of mutual destruction. Nulfang exhaled a long, measured breath of hot, ash-scented air that ruffled the collar of Mara's jacket. It shifted its massive weight backward onto its powerful hind legs. It did not turn and flee in a blind panic, like the lesser creatures of Carthay 9 had done upon her arrival. It simply took 2 deliberate, careful steps in reverse, putting a calculated, highly respectful distance between itself and the human envoy. It was formally conceding the psychological engagement. It recognized, through instinct or ancient programming, that the small creature standing before it was not an easy lock, not a guaranteed risk-free kill. It was a chaotic variable too dangerous to engage without careful, extended consideration. The suffocating tension in my primary chest cavity uncoiled slightly, a premature wave of intense relief washing over my paralyzed, trembling limbs. We had survived the impossible. The ultimate apex predator of the worst quarantine zone in the galaxy had actually backed down from a human. But my profound relief shattered a fraction of a second later, replaced by a cold dread vastly deeper than before. Nulfang did not keep its sensory organs locked on Mara as it continued its slow retreat. Its massive head suddenly snapped sharply to the right, staring directly through the thick, reinforced titanium bulkheads of the station floor, looking straight down toward the swirling violet atmosphere of the planetary crust thousands of miles below. The creature's incredibly dense, muscular frame visibly shuddered. Nulfang was not retreating from Mara because she had successfully intimidated it. It was completely ignoring us now because its highly tuned, deep-crust sensory organs had just detected a massive seismic and biological vibration echoing up from the surface. It was a resonance that made even the apex enforcer of a weaponized Deathworld hesitate. Nulfang let out a low, vibrating rumble of profound distress that physically rattled my internal organs against my ribs. And then it turned and sprinted down the dark corridor, moving with desperate, fleeing speed. It was running away from a waking nightmare vastly more profound than anything currently standing on the orbital station. The beast was fleeing because the true master, the hidden heart of the planet, was finally opening its eyes in the dark. The echoing silence left in the wake of the retreating beast hung heavy in the transport corridor. My primary respiratory gills flared wide, desperate to purge the intoxicating, metallic scent of the creature's sheer presence. We did not waste precious moments dissecting the miraculous nature of our survival. The violent shudder of the deck plating beneath our boots served as a terrifying reminder that the true crisis had not passed. It had merely shifted its focus downward. We navigated a labyrinth of secondary access tunnels, bypassing the locked-down main arteries, until we breached the doorway of Auxiliary Sub-Control Center 9. It was a cramped, utilitarian space, illuminated only by the pale, cold light of inactive monitor banks. The station command had locked me out of the primary network, but they had fundamentally underestimated the ingenuity of a desperate xenobiologist with physical access to a localized data node. I bypassed the biometric scanners manually, tearing open a wall panel and splicing the optical fibers directly into my personal data pad. It took exactly 45 seconds for the decryption algorithms to chew through the hastily erected firewalls, protecting the local cache. When the hidden files finally unspooled across the main holographic display, the sheer scale of the deception laid bare before me was staggering. The files did not contain ecological surveys or atmospheric models. They held ancient, fragmented blueprints. Carthay 9 was never a natural celestial body. The swirling violet storms, the tectonic instability, the hyper-aggressive microflora, none of it was the product of random, chaotic evolution. The entire planet was a discarded incubator. It was an impossibly old, planetary-scale biological warfare nursery, seeded thousands of millennia ago by a precursor race whose name had long been ground into cosmic dust. They had not built machines to fight their wars. They had cultivated ecosystems. My compound eyes scanned the scrolling data streams, struggling to comprehend the terrifying magnitude of the cosmic architecture. The creature we had just faced, the colossal entity designated as Nullfang, was not the apex predator of this world. It was merely a biological gatekeeper. It was a living, breathing security protocol, engineered to maintain a precarious, violent balance among the lesser horrors roaming the surface. Nullfang's entire existence was designed to protect a localized, subterranean containment structure buried deep beneath the planetary crust. It was guarding the true core of the nightmare. The precursor texts referred to it conceptually as the heart predator. As I translated the ancient biological mechanics, my internal thermal regulators failed entirely, sending a chilling wave of absolute dread through my thorax. The heart predator did not possess elongated claws or heavily armored mandibles. It did not hunt for caloric sustenance. Its weapon was the complete, weaponized amplification of pure terror. The data detailed a creature capable of broadcasting a planetary-scale neurological resonance. When fully awakened, it would latch onto the primal fear centers of every living organism within its vast operational radius. It would push them past the threshold of panic, driving them into an endless, self-sustaining chain reaction of blind slaughter. It did not need to lift a single appendage to destroy an invading army. It simply forced the army to consume itself in a frenzy of localized madness. The entire planet, every creeping vine, every venomous insect, every armored beast was designed to become a synchronized, living weapon the moment the heart predator commanded it. And the highest echelons of the Orbital Coalition had known this the entire time. I stared at the classified memorandums flashing across the screen, bearing the digital signatures of my direct superiors. They had not funded Excavation Outpost No. 4 to study history. They had driven heavy, terra-boring drills into the planet's crust to capture the control mechanism. The Council intended to harness the heart predator's neurological broadcast frequency, seeking to secure a biological superweapon that could dominate entire star systems without firing a single kinetic round. I leaned heavily against the cold metal console, my mandibles clicking in a slow, defeated rhythm. For over 80 standard cycles, I had dedicated my life to the pure pursuit of scientific truth. I believed I was cataloging the universe to understand it, to find the underlying mathematical beauty in the chaos. In a single, devastating moment, I realized my entire career had been nothing more than a scouting mission for political ambition and military greed. Vale did not offer a comforting platitude. She did not waste breath on a long, righteous condemnation of my government's profound hubris. She stood over the tactical display, her dark eyes reflecting the harsh blue light of the holographic interface. Her mind, already calculating the variables of an impossible situation. Science is not innocent when it knows the exact consequences and chooses to continue anyway, she said quietly, her voice devoid of malice but heavy with the weight of countless, unseen histories. She tapped a sequence of keys, pulling up the live telemetry from the tether anchoring Nadir Halo to the planet below. Look at the synchronization metrics. I followed her gaze and felt a new, sharper kind of terror grip my primary heart. The massive terra-boring drill at outpost number 4 had inadvertently penetrated the outer shell of the ancient sensor network. But that was not what was waking the beast. The catalyst was us. The Station Council's decision to trigger the Code Black quarantine, to trap thousands of terrified civilian technicians in the outer rings while the captive beasts broke loose, had created a massive, localized spike of pure, unadulterated terror. The agony, the blind panic, the frantic pulses of emergency weapons fire, all of it was funneling directly down the tether, feeding straight into the deep crust receivers of the precursor array. We were inadvertently transmitting the exact biological activation codes the heart predator had been waiting millennia to hear. Nullfang did not retreat because it acknowledged a stalemate, Mara deduced, tracing the creature's projected trajectory down through the station's core toward the planetary drop pods. It recognized the activation sequence. Its primal instinct overrode its immediate territorial aggression. It is rushing back down to the surface to take up its defensive position at the core before the central entity fully emerges from its dormant state. I looked at the orbital schematics. Then we must abandon the platform immediately. We need to reach the auxiliary hangar bays and launch a long-range shuttle before the station is completely overrun. Mara shook her head, a slow, grim movement that shattered my last desperate hope for a simple retreat. It will not matter if we reach the upper atmosphere. Read the maximum broadcast radius of the core entity's neurological wave. I checked the translated precursor data. The numbers were catastrophic. If the heart predator reached its fully awakened, active phase, its fear amplification field would not be confined to the atmospheric envelope of Carthay 9. It would radiate outward, easily enveloping the entire orbital space. Nadir Halo, the escape shuttles, and any coalition fleet attempting a rescue within 1 million kilometers would be caught in the blast. The crews would be driven violently insane, tearing each other apart in the cold vacuum of space. The entire sector would become a dead zone of self-inflicted slaughter. We cannot run away from it, Mara stated, her voice steady, possessing the calm, chilling resolve of an apex predator, acknowledging the parameters of a final, desperate hunt. We have to break the signal. We have to go down to the core. She turned away from the console and began walking toward the heavy blast doors leading to the planetary drop pod bays. She was a solitary, unarmored human, preparing to willingly dive into the heart of a biological weapon that had slept since the dawn of recorded history. I stood frozen in the pale light of the control room. The logical, data-driven protocols of my species demanded that I find a secure locker, hide, and wait for an inevitable end. But as I watched the human step into the shadows, I realized the data was utterly useless here. Equations could not stop the terror waking up beneath the crust. I uncoupled my datapad, letting it fall uselessly to the floor, and took a step forward. I was no longer a researcher cataloging a deathworld. I was stepping out of the comfortable, sterile role of an observer to become an active witness to a choice that would permanently alter the destiny of the entire Orbital Coalition. The descent was a violent blur of extreme gravitational forces and screaming atmospheric friction. Our emergency drop pod slammed into the crust of Carthay 9 with the kinetic fury of a falling meteor. tearing a deep trench through the volatile soil before grinding to a catastrophic halt. The structural integrity field collapsed with a dying whine, and the primary hatch blew outward, inviting the Deathworld inside. I stumbled out of the smoking wreckage alongside Mara and the 3 surviving civilian technicians we had managed to pull from the logistics corridor. The moment my boots touched the dirt, the true, unfiltered reality of the planet assaulted my senses. The sky above us was not a void of space, nor was it a welcoming canopy of clouds. It was a bruised, suffocating canopy of thick violet smog. Atmospheric storms raged with terrifying horizontal ferocity, sending jagged forks of crimson lightning tearing across the surface parallel to the ground, rather than striking from above. The very stone beneath us felt alive, glowing with a sickly, rhythmic luminescence that pulsed in perfect synchronization with the deep, tectonic groans of the planetary mantle. I inhaled, and my respiratory membranes instantly burned as if I had swallowed localized acid. The air was incredibly dense, saturated with the bitter stench of heated minerals and caustic tectonic venting. I fell to my knees, gagging on the toxic atmosphere, my internal regulators screaming in systemic overload. I expected the human to share my incapacitation. Instead, Mara Vale moved with a fluid, instinctual grace that entirely shed her previous diplomatic facade. She did not panic. She removed her heavy environmental gloves, pressing her bare palms flat against the vibrating, luminous soil. She closed her eyes, not in prayer, but in deep concentration, feeling the microscopic seismic tremors traveling through the crust. She stood, licking a finger, and raising it to test the caustic wind, reading the invisible currents of the toxic air. In that desolate, hostile wasteland, she did not look like an envoy sent by a civilized government. She looked like an ancient, primal hunter returning to a familiar hunting ground. She pointed toward a jagged ridgeline in the distance, silently commanding the terrified technicians to move. We marched through the nightmare. Our path forced us into a sprawling, terrifying biome the precursor data had designated as the silicate woods. There were no organic leaves or wooden trunks here. The forest was composed entirely of towering, crystalline structures, grown from the heavy mineral deposits and shaped by the violent electromagnetic winds. They were breathtakingly beautiful, catching the crimson lightning in a dazzling display of refracted light. But they were fundamentally lethal. The crystalline branches were heavily loaded with structural tension, sensitive to the slightest environmental shift. We were halfway through the dense, glittering maze when the ambient temperature suddenly plummeted by at least 20 degrees in the span of a single heartbeat. A localized thermal anomaly swept through the grove. I heard a sharp, agonizing crack echo from the massive crystalline trunk directly to my right. I froze, my compound eyes tracking the spreading fracture. I lacked the physical speed to react. Mara did not. She lunged across the jagged terrain, grabbing the heavy reinforced straps of my harness. She violently hurled her entire body weight backward, dragging me down into a shallow depression in the soil. Exactly half a second later, the towering silica tree detonated. The thermal shock caused the tension-loaded crystal to violently shatter, sending a devastating shockwave of razor-sharp, microscopic glass shrapnel tearing through the exact space where my head had been. The deadly rain shredded the heavy fabric of our hazard suits and scarred the rocks around us. I lay in the dirt, my primary heart hammering against my ribs, staring at the small human who had just risked her own physical integrity to pull me from the firing line. She did not wait for a gesture of gratitude. She simply checked her own suit for breaches, nodded once to confirm I was intact, and signaled the group to keep moving. We sought shelter in a shallow, naturally occurring cavern as the planetary rotation brought the brutal, freezing darkness of the Deathworld night. We huddled together, rationing our meager thermal charges. The adrenaline of the crash and the march finally began to fade, replaced by the crushing psychological weight of our situation. One of the surviving civilian technicians, a young communications specialist shivering violently in his torn suit, broke the heavy silence. His voice cracked with raw, unfiltered guilt. He confessed that he had read the restricted logs before the quarantine protocols locked the network. The station council had not merely excavated the central node. They had actively attempted to interface with it. They had bombarded the gatekeeper beast with highly concentrated, weaponized neural spikes, attempting to forcefully rewrite its synaptic pathways to establish remote control. That agonizing digital torture was the catalyst. That was what shattered the delicate biological rhythm of the planet and sent the ecosystem into a chaotic, erratic frenzy. I expected Mara to react with fury, to condemn the coalition for their profound, arrogant cruelty. Instead, she merely absorbed the confession with a cold, analytical stare. She processed the tactical value of the information, filing it away, without letting the emotional weight compromise her focus. Sitting there in the freezing dark, observing her stoic profile illuminated by the faint glow of the thermal charge, I finally understood why humanity terrified the civilized galaxy. It was not because they possessed a genetic predisposition for violence or a love of slaughter. It was because they possessed the horrifying ability to maintain absolute, crystal-clear cognitive function while standing directly in the center of lethal, bloody chaos. They did not shut down when the universe tried to kill them. They started solving the problem. I asked her, my voice barely a raspy whisper against the howling wind outside, how her species managed to endure such a mindset. Mara leaned back against the cavern wall, her eyes reflecting the dim light. She spoke of Earth, not as a paradise, but as a relentless, unforgiving crucible. She recounted how early humans survived global ice ages with nothing but animal skins and fire. She spoke of localized plagues that wiped out half of their continental populations, of crossing vast, crushing oceans in fragile wooden vessels, of carving civilizations out of scorching deserts, and of enduring brutal, mechanized global wars. "We do not admire danger, Rhal," she said softly, wrapping a torn piece of fabric around her bruised hand. "We do not seek it out for the thrill. But we learned extremely early in our evolutionary cycle that you cannot negotiate with a freezing winter or reason with a tectonic fault line. You either learn to look the danger directly in the eye, learn its patterns, and adapt, or you fade into the fossil record." The shared misery of the freezing cave stripped away the last remnants of our professional barriers. I asked her the one question that defied all my logical models. I asked her why she chose this specific, suicidal profession. She did not offer a grand, heroic speech. Her tone flattened, becoming incredibly heavy. She confessed that 4 years ago, she was part of a rapid response rescue team deployed to a failing mining colony on the moon of Titan. A localized seismic event had trapped 40 miners deep underground. The Corporate Oversight Committee in orbit calculated the financial cost of a deep crust extraction against the projected insurance payouts. They deemed the rescue operation statistically unviable. They ordered her squad to stand down and seal the atmospheric vents. "I lost 2 of my best friends on that rock because a bureaucrat looked at a spreadsheet and decided their heartbeats were not worth the fuel expenditure," she stated, her jaw tightening. "I swore that day I would never again allow the high-ranking officials of any government or corporation to calculate the value of human life as a mere statistical fraction." We did not exchange emotional platitudes. The bond forming between us was not built on comforting words. It was forged in the raw, brutal reality of survival. It was built when I used my extended reach to pull her up a sheer, crumbling cliff face the next morning. It was solidified when she expertly packed a caustic burn on my arm with localized neutralizing clay. We learned to trust each other in the absolute, terrifying silence of the hunt. By the time the violet sun reached its zenith, the terrain shifted. The jagged rocks gave way to a massive, perfectly circular depression in the crust. We stood at the edge of the ancient crater. It was not a natural impact zone. It sloped downward into infinite darkness, resembling the massive, unblinking eye of the planet itself, staring up at the orbital platform. We stood on the precipice, looking down into the abyss. There was no mechanical hum of precursor machinery. There was no digitized alarm. Rising from the impenetrable depths of the crater was a slow, deep, rhythmic thumping. It vibrated through the soles of our boots and resonated perfectly with the fear centers of our brains. It was the sound of a planetary heart, slowly waking from a long, enforced slumber, and methodically learning how to remember the sensation of its own endless hunger. The descent into the crater felt less like spelunking and more like walking down the throat of a sleeping leviathan. The walls of the abyss were not jagged stone, but a smooth, petrified substance resembling fossilized bone marrow. We navigated the spiraling descent until the narrow passage opened into a cavernous, subterranean chamber. This was not a control room in any conventional, mechanical sense. There were no metallic consoles or glass screens. The precursor technology was entirely biological. Massive, calcified neural pathways crisscrossed the floor like the roots of ancient, dead trees, converging on a central, pulsing node of bioluminescent amber sap. I knelt beside an exposed cluster of fibrous optical nerves, stripping the outer casing from my datapad's primary interface cable. I spliced my crude hardware directly into the ancient, dormant network. The decryption algorithms I had stolen from the orbital station went to work, translating the chemical and electrical impulses of the extinct civilization into a legible dialect. The truth of Carthay 9 flooded my screen, completely shattering any remaining illusions I held about the nature of this planet. The precursors had not built this world as a weapons factory. They had built it as a philosophical crucible. The archives detailed the creation of the heart predator. It was engineered to ask a single, devastating question of the cosmos. Which species deserves to exist when fear becomes a weapon? The precursor civilization had reached the apex of their technological and biological prowess, but they found themselves paralyzed by the ethical boundaries of their own power. They created the ultimate terror to test their own evolutionary worth, to see if their society could withstand an entity that weaponized their deepest panics. They failed their own test. The records documented their rapid, horrifying decline. When exposed to the localized fear broadcasts of their own creation, the precursors could no longer distinguish between rational self-defense and the blind, paranoid need for absolute domination. They turned on each other, tearing their vast empire apart in a frenzy of preemptive slaughter. In their final, dying days, realizing their catastrophic error, they genetically forged the beast known as Nullfang. They placed it at the door of the crypt as the ultimate biological padlock, praying to the silent stars that no future civilization would be foolish enough to disturb the core. Mara read the translated text over my shoulder, the amber light of the chamber casting long shadows across her face. She absorbed the tragic history of a dead species, her mind connecting the ancient data to the terrifying encounter we had survived in the station corridors. "That is why the gatekeeper backed away from us," she said, her voice echoing softly in the massive, vaulted chamber. Nullfang is programmed to recognize the scent of prey and the challenge of a rival predator. But when I lowered my hands, it sensed a complete biological paradox. It encountered an organism fully capable of extreme violence, yet choosing not to default to it. She stepped toward the central, pulsing amber node, looking deep into the glowing core. To an ecosystem built entirely on the rigid binary of killing or being killed. A creature that chooses restraint while holding a knife breaks the algorithm. It recognized that we possess the capacity for slaughter, but we do not let the fear dictate the strike. Her words struck me with a profound, paradigm-shifting weight. I looked at my own trembling claws and then thought of the Orbital Coalition. For hundreds of centuries, my people had lived in a state of manufactured, sterile safety. We built impenetrable orbital rings and energy shields, convincing ourselves we were highly evolved because we eradicated danger from our daily lives. But that safety had made us incredibly fragile. Because we viewed every threat as an anomaly that must be systematically destroyed. We had become entirely dependent on absolute control rather than organic adaptation. When the Station Council realized they could not control the heart predator, their immediate, instinctual response was to sacrifice their own people and hide. Mara turned to face me, the reflection of the bioluminescent core burning in her dark eyes. She delivered a truth that redefined my entire understanding of the galactic hierarchy. We did not win the survival lottery because we were more dangerous than everything else hiding in the dark. We won because we still possessed the capacity to care for each other, even after looking directly at the terrifying things. The profound silence of the chamber was suddenly shattered by a violent, localized tremor. The calcified roots beneath our boots heaved, and the amber node flared with an aggressive, blinding crimson light. My datapad emitted a series of frantic, high-pitched warning tones. The ancient telemetry network was updating. It was reading the atmospheric conditions above the crust. The heart predator was feeding. It was not consuming flesh. It was gorging itself on a massive, concentrated wave of systemic terror, echoing down from the orbital tether. I rapidly accessed the Coalition command frequencies, my blood turning to ice as I decrypted the incoming military transmissions. The Station Council, terrified by the containment breach and the loss of the civilian sectors, had enacted the ultimate scorched earth protocol. They had summoned the primary Coalition armada. The data streams indicated that a massive fleet of heavily armed dreadnoughts would arrive in orbital range in exactly 1 hour. Their standing orders were absolute. They were preparing to initiate a complete, synchronized plasma bombardment to glass the entire surface of the planet. "They are going to incinerate the crust," I whispered, the crushing weight of the impending genocide paralyzing my vocal cords. "They believe extreme kinetic force will solve the problem." "It will do the exact opposite," Mara snapped, instantly grasping the catastrophic biological mechanics at play. "You cannot kill a creature that feeds on the resonance of terror by dropping bombs on it." The sheer panic of a planetary bombardment, the localized fear of thousands of orbital troops preparing for a massacre, will act as the final catalyst. If that fleet opens fire, the heart predator will absorb the trauma, wake completely, and expand its broadcast radius across the entire sector. Everyone within 10 light-years will tear their own ships apart. The only way to keep the ancient lock sealed was to break the resonance loop. We had to stop the thousands of people currently panicking in orbit from succumbing to total, blind terror. We had to stop the fleet from firing. I looked down at my datapad. I possessed the raw, unencrypted precursor files. I possessed the undeniable proof of the Council's treason, their deliberate activation of a galactic-level threat for military gain. I was a decorated scholar of the highest academic order, deeply entrenched in the political safety of the Coalition. To use this terminal meant permanently severing my ties to my homeworld. It meant branding myself a traitor, a rogue agent, and a target for the rest of my natural life. I did not hesitate for a single second. I bypassed the localized orbital relays entirely, splicing my connection directly into the massive deep space communication array buried in the planetary mantle. I dropped every security protocol, every encryption key, and every classification filter. I opened a massive, unshielded broadcasting channel to every receiver in the quadrant. I transmitted the complete precursor history, the true nature of the heart predator, the Council's damning internal memos, and the catastrophic consequences of the impending orbital strike. I broadcasted the truth to the approaching Coalition fleet, and, more importantly, I sent the telemetry coordinates to the human military vessels I knew were patrolling the neighboring sectors. I stepped out from the comfortable, sterile shadow of the passive observer. I chose a side. The transmission uploaded in a massive burst of raw data. The ambient glow of the chamber dimmed slightly. The power diverted to throw the signal across the stars. Then, a heavy, scraping sound echoed from the entrance of the subterranean tunnel. The temperature in the room plummeted. The massive, void black silhouette of Nulfang materialized from the darkness. The gatekeeper had returned. It stood at the threshold of the core chamber, its bone crown scraping against the petrified ceiling. Its multi-jointed limbs were tensed, heavily corded with lethal muscle, and its fathomless sensory pits were locked entirely on Mara. But it did not charge. It did not roar or display its serrated mandibles. It simply sat back heavily onto its powerful hind legs, blocking the only exit. It lowered its massive head, adopting a posture of terrifying, expectant stillness. The apex beast of the Deathworld had not come to kill the intruders. It had come to watch. It was waiting in the silence of the ancient tomb to see if the small, fragile human would prove herself to be just another hunter, driven by fear. Or if she was truly capable of becoming the new gatekeeper. The orbital space above the swirling violet atmosphere became a parking lot for absolute annihilation. High above our subterranean descent, exactly 32 heavy dreadnoughts of the Coalition Armada dropped from faster-than-light transit. They formed a tight, aggressive blockade ring around the quarantined Deathworld. Their unified plasma batteries glowed with the blinding intensity of nascent suns, charging to 100% capacity. The High Council, terrified by the data packets I had broadcasted, had chosen the coward's path. They intended to execute a controlled, synchronized planetary bombardment. They were convinced that turning the entire crust of Carthay 9 into a sea of molten glass was the only secure method to sterilize the biological anomaly before it could fully awaken. Then, the void tore open. It was not the disciplined, synchronized arrival characteristic of Coalition fleets. It was a violent, brute force tear in the fabric of space. A human battle group cascaded into the firing lanes, spearheaded by the massive, scarred hull of a command carrier under the authority of Admiral Soren Pike. They did not lock their targeting lasers onto the Coalition vessels. They did not power up their kinetic railguns to initiate a preemptive strike. Instead, they executed a maneuver of breathtaking tactical audacity. They rotated their massive, blocky ships, interposing their reinforced armor plating directly between the charging Coalition dreadnoughts and the vulnerable planet below. They projected their overlapping energy shields outward, creating a massive, glowing umbrella over the firing lines. The diplomatic tension instantly soared to a point of catastrophic failure. The deadlock was forged on a razor wire of interstellar politics. If Admiral Pike fired upon the Coalition to defend the planet, humanity would instantly validate every xenophobic fear the High Council harbored, branding themselves as an aggressive, uncontrollable threat. They would become the very monsters the galaxy accused them of being. Yet, if the human ship stood down and allowed the bombardment to commence, the massive kinetic and thermal trauma inflicted upon the planet's surface would guarantee the absolute activation of the heart predator, condemning millions of lives across the sector to a frenzy of self-inflicted slaughter. The universe held its breath, trapped in a standoff where any kinetic action guaranteed mutual destruction. Down in the precursor tomb, the physical world began to tear itself apart in response to the escalating tension in the stars. The localized seismic activity spiked exponentially. The petrified, calcified roots beneath our boots shattered as the planetary mantle heaved and buckled. But the physical destruction of the crust was entirely eclipsed by the psychic shockwave that followed. The heart predator, disturbed by the massive accumulation of fear radiating from the orbital standoff, began to actively manipulate the cognitive fields of every conscious entity within its waking radius. I collapsed against the cavern wall, my secondary nervous system short-circuited entirely. For the very first time in my heavily insulated, academic existence, I felt a primal, suffocating horror that could not be quantified, graphed, or categorized into neat data streams. It was the pure, distilled essence of absolute panic. It bypassed my rational mind completely. I heard a voice echoing, not in my auditory receptors, but deep within the folds of my cerebral cortex. It was a dark, insidious, pulling whisper rising from the subterranean depths. It did not threaten me with pain. Instead, it promised an immediate end to the suffocating terror, offering the sweet, mindless release of giving in to the slaughter. I felt my mandibles clicking in a frantic, uncontrollable rhythm. My claws scraped aimlessly against the stone, desperate to tear at my own carapace just to replace the psychological agony with physical pain. The sheer weight of the fear was crushing my identity into dust. Vale moved through the suffocating wave of terror, like a ship cutting through a tempest. She was not immune to the psychic assault. I could see the rigid tension in her jaw and the heavy, labored rhythm of her breathing. But she processed the fear differently. She refused to let it pilot her actions. She grabbed my heavy shoulders, her grip bruising and absolute, physically anchoring me to the reality of the cavern. She did not shout meaningless comforts over the grinding roar of the tectonic plates. She pulled me down, forcing my erratic compound eyes to lock onto her dark, unyielding stare. She demanded that I speak. She ordered me, her voice cutting through the telepathic static in my mind like a surgical laser, to recite the name of every single biosphere I had ever preserved. She forced me to list the fragile species I had pulled from the brink of extinction. She made me reconstruct my crumbling mind, not from abstract theories or logical resistance, but from the solid foundation of living memory. I gasped, choking on the caustic air, and forced my vocal cords to obey. I spoke of the luminous reef builders of the eastern spiral arm. I whispered the migratory patterns of the great solar whales navigating the binary stars. I listed the atmospheric compositions of my favorite sanctuary worlds. With every name I dragged from my memory, with every concrete detail of life I forced into the cavern, the crushing, telepathic weight of the ancient weapon receded a fraction of an inch. She pulled me back from the abyss of madness, using the sheer, undeniable gravity of my own life's work. She taught me, in the darkest hole in the universe, how to wield my compassion as a kinetic shield against terror. I stood up, my limbs trembling violently, but my cognitive functions fully intact. We turned toward the final, plunging corridor leading directly to the planetary core. Nullfang still blocked the path. The void black gatekeeper beast did not move to attack us, nor did it retreat into the shadows. It stood perfectly still, acting as the ultimate biological toll booth. This was the final mandate of the extinct precursor civilization. The creature's complex olfactory sensors flared wide, drinking in the chemical and electromagnetic signatures of our mental states. It was judging if we had genuinely conquered the fear response, or if we were merely suppressing it beneath a fragile layer of false bravery. To pass the beast while harboring hidden terror meant bringing a spark directly into the core of the powder keg. It was the ultimate test of planetary admission. Mara stepped up to the massive entity, placing herself well within the lethal striking distance of its multi-jointed limbs. She tilted her head up to meet its fathomless, dark gaze. Once again, she smiled. However, the context of this specific expression had profoundly shifted from our encounter in the station corridor. It was no longer the calculated, dangerous projection of a rival predator claiming its territory. It was a quiet, solemn acknowledgement. It was a silent communication bridging an impossible gap between an ancient, engineered planetary guardian and a natural-born survivor from a distant dirt rock. The smile conveyed a mutual, profound understanding that neither of them required a display of bloodshed to validate their right to exist in the dark. They were two predators who understood the fundamental mechanics of the universe well enough to know that true strength lay in the choice not to strike. Nullfang exhaled a massive, rumbling breath of heated ash that washed over us like a localized storm. Its heavy, calcified bone crown lowered in a slow, deliberate motion of concession. The massive creature shifted its incredible weight, stepping sideways into the shadows of the cavern wall. It yielded the center path. It was an ancient, biological algorithm, finally granting clearance. The beast acknowledged that humanity had successfully passed the impossible psychological filter left behind by a dead empire. We walked past the massive guardian, descending the final ramp into the true core of Carthay 9. But the miraculous, precarious balance we had achieved in the dirt could not hold the escalating tension burning in the stars. High above the swirling atmosphere, the crushing psychological pressure of the orbital standoff finally snapped. Aboard a coalition perimeter cruiser, a junior artillery officer, utterly overwhelmed by the latent, creeping dread radiating from the planet below, panicked. Without authorization from the high command, his trembling claw slammed down heavily onto the primary firing console. A single, brilliant lance of superheated plasma tore through the cold vacuum of space, striking the heavy shields of the human blockade. And deep within the planetary mantle, bathed in the amber glow of the precursor nursery, the heart predator finally opened its eyes. The rogue plasma strike from orbit slammed against the human blockade. Even though Admiral Soren Pike's energy shields absorbed the kinetic fury of the blast, the sheer, sudden influx of violent intent was enough. The vibration echoed down the orbital tether, a clarion call of unadulterated hostility pouring straight into the planetary mantle. The amber node in the center of the subterranean cavern erupted from a dull pulse into a blinding, searing white star. The petrified floor beneath our boots bucked violently. Carthay 9 was no longer a planet. It was a single, colossal organism waking from a millennial nightmare. Through the telemetry feed on my datapad, I watched the biological markers of every creature on the surface redline. The silica-spiders, the whisperweeds, the Varese hounds. Every single organism shifted instantly into a state of absolute, hyperkinetic predatory frenzy. The ambient air in the core chamber grew so thick with psychic static that I could barely draw breath. My hands instinctively reached for the heavy plasma cutter Mara had discarded earlier, driven by a blind, irrational urge to smash the glowing node into fragments. Mara grabbed my wrist. Her grip was iron. She realized immediately that unleashing kinetic violence upon the core would only validate its programming. If we attacked it, we would simply become another variable in its endless equation of fear and slaughter. Instead, she stepped directly into the center of the biological synaptic array. She told me to splice my datapad into the primary feedback loop, to use my ecological models to channel her neural transmission directly into the heart predator's cognitive stream. She was going to act as a biological anchor, broadcasting a reverse signal into the void. High above the swirling storms, the tactical situation reached its absolute zenith. Admiral Pike, monitoring the massive energy spike from the planetary core, made a decision that defied every standard military doctrine. He ordered his command carrier and the entire human battle group to completely drop their defensive energy shields. They hung completely naked in the void, their hulls exposed to the fully charged plasma batteries of 32 coalition dreadnoughts. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, Pike broadcasted the raw, unencrypted precursor data I had uploaded, projecting it on every open communication channel across the coalition fleet. He forced the High Command to listen to the truth. He forced them to watch as humanity, the species they had classified as a barbaric anomaly, risked total annihilation to save the very people who had tried to bury them. The coalition armada fractured. Several perimeter ships demanded to fire, terrified by the planetary readings. But the Supreme Commander, absorbing the undeniable weight of my scientific testimony, issued a sector-wide override. He ordered a complete and total ceasefire. Back in the cavern, Mara pressed her bare hands directly against the searing surface of the amber node. The heart predator immediately lashed out, not with physical claws, but with a devastating, concentrated hallucination designed to break her mind. I watched her muscles lock rigid as the psychic assault hit her. The ancient machine flooded her consciousness with her deepest, most agonizing traumas. Through the localized biofeedback monitor, I caught fragmented, terrifying echoes of her visions. I saw the collapsing tunnels of the Titan mining colony. I saw the faces of her lost teammates, their voices screaming for a rescue that never came. I saw the world burning, consumed by a fire she could not extinguish. The creature was trying to drown her in the bitter, suffocating paralyzation of her own failures. It demanded that she surrender to the panic, to either flee into madness or lash out in blind rage. But Mara did not try to forcefully deny the fear. She did not build a mental fortress of false bravado to block out the screams. She absorbed the horrifying visions, accepted the crushing weight of her grief, and embraced the terror as a fundamental, necessary component of living. She transmitted a stable, unwavering biological rhythm back into the core. It was a neurological signature the heart predator had never encountered in its entire, ancient existence. It was the mind of a creature that was profoundly terrified, deeply scarred by loss, yet consciously choosing to stand its ground and protect the fragile things behind it. This profound psychological contradiction introduced an unresolvable paradox into the precursor machine's rigid programming. The heart predator was fundamentally designed to operate on a binary system. Fear must inevitably lead to either frantic flight or mindless slaughter. Presented with a highly evolved intellect that experienced intense fear but chose compassion and defense instead, the ancient algorithm simply could not compute. The logic loop shattered. The blinding white light of the amber node flickered, violently glitching as the central entity failed to complete its hunting cycle. In the massive tunnel directly behind us, Nullfang threw back its heavy, bone-crowned head and unleashed a planetary-scale roar. It was not a cry of aggression, but a booming, resonant command that carried across the tectonic plates and up through the violent atmosphere. It was the gatekeeper enforcing the ancient directive. The ecosystem heard the master's voice, and the global frenzy instantly halted. The heart predator, its core logic utterly broken by a human heart, collapsed back upon itself. The blinding light faded to a dull, dormant amber, and the planetary pulse slowed to a quiet, sleeping rhythm. Carthay 9 narrowly escaped its own apocalypse. Nadir Halo was swiftly evacuated by the very human fleet the Station Council had tried to manipulate. The classified data logs were laid bare before the galactic public, completely exposing the reckless military ambitions of the Orbital Council. I formally and publicly resigned my commission from the exobiological division. I shed the sterile robes of an impartial observer to become the primary witness for a radically new interstellar treaty. 3 standard months later, I stood before the Grand Assembly of the Interstellar Council. The vast amphitheater was silent as I presented my final, comprehensive assessment of humanity. I formally proposed that Earth no longer be classified as a Deathworld anomaly or a threat class civilization. I petitioned the Council to designate them as a guardian world. They were a species terrifying enough to make the ultimate monsters of the universe back away, yet possessing a spirit kind enough to use that terrible strength to shield the weak. As the decree was officially recorded into the Galactic Registry, I looked across the chamber to the human delegation. Mara Vale caught my eye. She smiled, very slightly. It was a subtle, quiet expression, but it no longer carried the chilling, calculated weight of a pursuit predator marking its territory. It was a calm, reassuring signal, confirming to the entire galaxy that the dark had a new, vigilant gatekeeper. Thank you all for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can connect and share our thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the Sci-Fi Stories channel, like the video, and support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.